All right. Well, Psalm 91. I'm going to read through the psalm. It's not that long to start here, and I'll sort of telegraph the places that we're going to spend some time camping. So what I want to do is I want to go through the psalm and make some comments as to the Hebrew Bible context of the psalm. And then we're going to drift into, well, how is this psalm understood or thought about in Jesus' day, Second Temple period, and of course on into the 1st century AD, which is part of the Second Temple period. And that's how we'll go. So we're gonna cover both Old and New Testament here, because the Old Testament stuff is going to sort of again create a framework for what's going on in the New Testament. And it's actually going to matter, because here's a little heads up. Psalm 91 is actually one of the places in the Old Testament that Satan quotes in his confrontation with Jesus. And he wasn't really talking about the coronavirus. But the fact that Psalm 91 is one of those places is actually interesting. And it's interesting for a number of specific reasons that I don't think will occur to, again, the normal Bible reader or Bible student. So Psalm 91, let's just read it. I'm reading from ESV. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High. And let me just stop there. Isn't it interesting? Most High. Most High, Elyon. Where have we heard of Most High before? Oh, that would be Deuteronomy 32. Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Okay, Yahweh dispenses the nations, allots the nations to the lesser sons of God, who become, again, hostile supernatural forces in the course of the Old Testament. So we'll stow that away. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. For he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the deadly pestilence. Now, pestilence, we're going to camp on that word in a bit. It's the word dever. Interestingly enough, and this is the only time I'm going to mention this because I don't want to rabbit trail into how the Septuagint translator misread a word, but here's a good example where they do. Dever, Dalet Bet Resh in Hebrew, is also not just the word for plague, but again, Hebrew has homonyms. It's also the word for word. And so the Septuagint has, he will rescue you from the trap of hunters and from a terrifying word, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But anyway, dever is not the Hebrew word for word here. It's something else, and we'll get to that. So verse 4, he will cover you with his pinions. And if you're like me, I wonder, what's a pinion? The NCV, New Century Version, has feathers, so it's probably part of the wing or something like that, or maybe just the feathers. I don't know. I'm not an authority on the word pinion in English. And under his wings, so pinions and wings must have some relationship there. Under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and buckler. Okay, stow that away, shield and buckler. Because the next verse, again, gets us into more of these terrors and threats. And again, I'll give you a little heads up. These terrors and threats, along with dever, pestilence, in the preceding in verse 3, these are going to be references to names of Canaanite deities, which, of course, to the Second Temple Jewish mind is going to be a demon. And isn't it interesting how, if the passage is really talking about demons, that we get references to sheltering, the Lord sheltering us with a shield and buckler. Sounds suspiciously like Ephesians 6. Okay? Ephesians 6:11 through 16. But just hold on to that. 1,000, or let me just back up to verse 5 here. You will not fear the terror of the night. Hebrew word is pachad. Nor the arrow that flies by day. We'll come back to the word arrow as well. Nor the pestilence, there's dever again, that stalks in darkness. Nor the destruction, the word there is ketev, that wastes at noonday. All these words we're going to spend some time on. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. You will not only look with your eyes and see the recompense of the wicked, because you have made the Lord your dwelling place, the Most High, there it is again, who is my refuge, No evil shall be allowed to befall you, no plague, and this term is generic, it's naga, so it's not one of these deity names. No plague will come near your tent. For he will command his angels concerning you. This is the part Satan quotes. He will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. Satan skips the next verse. You will tread on the lion and the adder. The young lion and the serpent you will trample underfoot. Guess Satan forgot that part. Because he holds fast to me in love, I will deliver him. I will protect him because he knows my name. When he calls to me, I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will rescue him and honor him. With long life, I will satisfy him and show him my salvation. So that's Psalm 91. And there's some interesting stuff in there. And I'm going to focus on verses 5 and 6 and verses 11 through 13 for a specific backdrop. It's really specific contextualizing the psalm, both in terms of, an Israelite reader and then a later, Second Temple Jewish, first century AD reader, New Testament era. So verses 5 and 6, let me just read them again. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in darkness, nor the destruction that wastes at noonday. So, again, without getting into too much detail, because that would be quite possible, and I do want to get into Second Temple stuff. Dead Sea Scroll material is going to matter here. And then into the New Testament, we have this reference to Deor. For those who are listening, it's just think of D-E-B-E-R, Deor. It's a V sound after a vowel in Hebrew. So we have a reference to that in verse 3, and we also get one later in verse 6. Deor, I'm going to quote from DDD now, Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible. Deor is one of the 3 proverbial causes of death on a wide scale. It is attested some 50 times in the Bible, along with war, including the words sword and blood, and famine, and it's mainly in Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Besides this empirical meaning, it seems to be used a number of times in a personified sense as a demon or evil deity. Now, we're going to get in a few moments to Habakkuk 3:5, where this is a little bit clearer. And Habakkuk 3:5 will not only mention Deor, it will also mention a deity known as Resheph. Hosea 13:14, again, has similar language. And we'll get to those in a moment, but just sort of to prep you with this. So Deor, again, to quote DDD once more, it seems to be used a number of times in a personified sense as a demon or evil deity. So just store that away. If we continue on, we hit verse 6. We have Ketev, that's Q-E-T, and it's the emphatic T in Hebrew, T with a dot underneath, Ketev, Q-E-T-E-B. I'm going to read from DDD again. The term Ketev appears 4 times in the Old Testament. Its basic significance is destruction, perhaps etymologically, that which is cut off, though the contexts suggest that other nuances are present. Various scholars have translated it as plague or pestilence in the context of its parallel use with Resheph or Deor. The term has overtones of a divine name because, and this is, unless you have a little bit of, Semitic linguistics under your belt, or you're really into etymology. Kezev, that's Q-Z-B in Ugaritic. Kezev occurs once in an Ugaritic text, KTU 1.5, column 2, line 24, who appears to be a kinsman, a relative of Mot. And that is, Mot is a very famous Ugaritic Canaanite deity, the god of death. So those two are mentioned in tandem. And that's part of the argument that Ketev is probably, again, another Canaanite deity. And when we get to Hosea 13 and 14 again, I might as well just read that because it's probably going to help here. So let me just go to Hosea quickly. Might factor in here. This is going to sound really familiar from the New Testament, but it's actually a citation from Hosea. I shall ransom them from the power of Sheol, the underworld. I shall redeem them from death. O death, where are your plagues? O Sheol, where is your sting? Compassion is hidden from my eyes. Now, this is, again, God speaking about the iniquity of Ephraim back in verse 12. I'm going to read verse 14 again, where the Lord is speaking again. It says, I shall ransom them from the power of Sheol. I shall redeem them from death. Death there is mot, okay, mavet in Hebrew, but mot in Canaanite. O death, where are your plagues? Guess what that word is? Dever. O death, where is Dever? O Sheol, where is your sting? Guess what that word is? Ketev. O Sheol, where is Ketev? So you could read Hosea 13 very easily because Mot is again quite a well-known Canaanite deity, personified death, and this also happens in the Hebrew Bible. Sheol is personified in a couple passages, and so is death, including this one because death is addressed. O death, O Mot, where are your plagues? Where's Dever and Ketev? Hey Mot, where's Dever and Ketev? And if God is saying, I'm going to ransom these people from the power of Sheol, this is a taunt. This is God, the God of Israel, saying to Mot, to death, the God of the Canaanites, hey, dude, where are your buddies? They're just not, they weren't too effective here because I'm ransoming these people from death. I'm taking them out of your hands. So again, you have a flavor here of a pretty strong theological polemic that really involves or sort of revolves around taking these terms as deity figures, which in Canaanite texts they were. Okay, there's good indication they were. So it helps sort of frame this discussion a little bit. Let me go back to DDD and its discussion of Ketev. And of course Paul picks up on this language in 1 Corinthians. But we're not going to rabbit trail there today. But back to Ketev, DDD says the most useful information about Ketev comes from Deuteronomy 32:24, where the following tricolon, 3 stanzas, occurs in Yahweh's curse of apostate Jacob. His people have apostatized. Deuteronomy 32:17, of course, which we reference all the time on the podcast here about Israel, going after, other gods, the Shadim, these territorial entities, again, referencing the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Israel runs into apostasy. They go into apostasy. And so if you look at Deuteronomy 32:24, let me just read it to you in the ESV, because DDD is going to take it apart a little bit in terms of the Hebrew wording here, but let's just get the flavor. Again, God is judging his people, for their apostasy. Verse 23 will start there. I will heap disasters upon them. I will spend my arrows on them. Okay, disasters is ra'ah. Arrows is just a familiar word for arrow, but it's going to become important here in a moment. They shall be wasted with hunger. This is verse 24, ra'ab, and devoured by plague. There's resheph. And poisonous pestilence, there's Ketev. So basically God is going to send these disasters on his people. But the terminology, again, in the wider Canaanite world was, again, these hostile supernatural forces. So back to DDD, it says, the useful information, Deuteronomy 32:24, here's what we read when Yahweh curses apostate Jacob. It says, again in Hebrew, mezev or mezeh ra'av, sucked dry by hunger. That's one description. And then u'lechume resheph, and devoured by pestilence, devoured by resheph. DDD says, thus, hunger is probably an epithet of Mot, because death had been mentioned earlier. The god of death, lechume, devoured, can also be construed as fought against. And then it references the arrow metaphor of verse 23 that we read, reference to the arrows. Pestilence is personified as Resheph, the plague god, and here's the important line. Resheph in Ugaritic is represented visually as an archer. He shoots arrows. Okay, so you have Resheph, again, this Canaanite deity / demon figure, for in Second Temple, parlance, who is, an archer. So that's going to become important when we see references to arrows along with ketev and dever and moat in other passages. All right, let's go, in fact, to Habakkuk 3:5. This is a good time to reference that. I mentioned it earlier, but Habakkuk 3:5 is kind of important. Now, for this is one of these passages where Yahweh marches from the south. We spent a lot of time talking about these in the Exodus series. In verse 5, in the midst of Yahweh coming from Timan and the Holy One from Mount Paran, so on and so forth, that's verse 3. When you hit verse 5, it says, before him, that is before God, like marching ahead of him, before him went pestilence. Okay, it's Dever. And plague followed at his heels, kind of coming up from behind. That's Resheph. So before Yahweh went Dever, and Resheph followed at his heels. And that's kind of an interesting verse, and we're going to talk a little bit about why. And as you're thinking about that, let me go back to the Hosea reference here and just read that again. So in Habakkuk 3:5, we've got two of these figures sort of in tow, marching under Yahweh's command, as it were, under his authority. In other words, they're not independent deities. They are lesser and subservient, okay? Then you go to Hosea 13. I shall ransom them from the power of Sheol. I shall redeem them from death. Moat. O death, O moat, where are your plagues? Again, where is Dever? O Sheol, where is Ketev? Okay? So you have these passages like this that personify these things. And scholars again who muck around in these texts have again noticed that these same terms are actually some of the gods of these surrounding nations, okay, and naturally they're rivals to the status of Yahweh of Israel, and a couple of them get referenced in Psalm 91. Again, that's the point. A couple of them get referenced very directly. We had Dever there, and let's go back to the psalm here just to pick up here again. So in verses 5 and 6, we have for sure Dever and Ketev, but then we have a reference to the arrow that flies by day. And is that Resheph? Well, it might be, because Resheph is an archer. Might be an oblique reference to him. So there's some kind of strange stuff going on in Psalm 91. Then if we loop in Habakkuk 3:5, and if we loop in Hosea 13:14, we've got a number of these terms, and they're personified even in the Hebrew Bible, but they're all under Yahweh's authority. I mean, he is clearly the superior in the picture. So I'm going to go to DDD again and read you a little bit about Resheph. DDD says this: the tradition of Resheph as a god of pestilence is attested in Deuteronomy 32:24 and Psalm 78:48. The first text, a passage of the Song of Moses, deals with those who provoked God to anger and were unfaithful. They were apostate. They are punished with hunger and destroyed by Resheph and Ketev. Quote, I will heap evils upon them, my arrows I will spend on them, wasted with hunger, devoured by Resheph and Ketev, the poisonous one. That's how DDD renders Deuteronomy 32:23 and 24. Continuing, it says, in the Old Testament, barad, that's another term we haven't encountered yet. Barad occurs in Psalm 78:48 in a passage which concerns the seventh plague of Egypt, where barad occurs in parallel with the Resheph. Barad is lightning, okay? And then it quotes the Hebrew text, he, that is Yahweh, gave up their cattle, the Egyptians' cattle, to barad. It's lightning or hail or both. Again, it's traditionally, we look at that as a fire. If you remember back to the plague episodes, these fiery hailstones. Again, the fiery part could be a way of describing lightning storm that yields hail, in other words. So he, Yahweh, gave up their cattle to barad and their herds to the Reshephs. Again, lightning bolts as arrows. Okay, think of arrows. We're using the language, the visual encounter, visual appearance, And then in the ancient Near Eastern world, this is going to get theologized because they don't know meteorology. They don't know, modern science or anything like this. So they see a lightning bolt, this is from the gods and it's a bad thing. And what the Bible is going to correct, it's actually going to push back on this in a couple of regards, and we'll get to that in a moment. But the notion that, like if you were not just an Israelite, but really anybody, that this is random and haphazard and so on and so forth, and that the gods are like fighting against you and against themselves, and there's competing interests. I mean, think of the like the Greek gods and whatnot. Zeus with the thunderbolts and all that. A similar idea. There's a certain randomness to it and capriciousness to it. That's one point that the Bible is going to push back on, but it's also going to essentially kind of demythologize the weather stuff. But we'll get to that in a moment. But here back again, the description is because it's written in the language of an observer. All right, and so the observer is going to interpret what's happening here as the wrath of God. And that's true. God, can step in and manipulate the weather and control it and use it as a judgment. I mean, that's just a given in biblical theology. But if it's God doing this, then it's not independent deities. Okay, that's the demythologizing part. So these things are in God's hand. They're not like, he doesn't need to go ask, hey, can you come into work early today? I got a plague. Can you show up and eat? No, it's not like that. It's not that kind of thinking. Where God has to sort of send an evil spirit so that lightning works. Again, we know that isn't the case. And again, the Bible, pushes back on that idea a little bit, but this is a very common concept, in the ancient world. So back to DDD, in Psalm 78, Yahweh gives up the Egyptians' cattle to Barad, lightning or hail, or both, and their herds to the Reshefs. In Isaiah 28:2, Barad is paralleled with a demon in the service of Yahweh, Ketev. Okay, and Ketev is under Yahweh's authority. Again, the biblical writers are using this notion. Think of it this way: they're using this notion that is widely held that these forces are, again, entities, these supernatural entities. But what the theological point the biblical writers are trying to make is that no, God just does this. He can do this in judgment, or he can withhold it, in mercy. And this isn't sort of it's not like a superhero pantheon of different forces like Storm, like the X-Men or something like that. So the Bible again actually pushes back on a little bit of this, but it uses the same language because that's what connects with the audience. Again, this is going to be very familiar. So DDD says, in Habakkuk 3:5, we have the description of a theophany and the attendant natural phenomena. God is described as a divine warrior, a lord of light. Before him goes Deor, master of epidemics, while Reshef, pestilence, follows on God's heels. Psalm 76:4 mentions doesn't have a vocalization here, but we've got the plural of Reshef and then Keshet, okay? An expression which could be interpreted as the reshefs of the bow, like a bow and arrow, and be related to the imagery of the God armed with bow and arrows. And then it quotes the psalm, in Zion God shattered, again, the reshefs of the bow, the shield, the sword, the weapons of war. Job 5:7, it goes on to say, is a very difficult text inserted in a passage dealing with the need for man of absolute trust in God. Here the, quote, sons of Reshef, the B'nai Reshef, are mentioned. And it says, and the sons of Reshef fly high. They seem to be winged demons, particularly if we think of Psalm 91:5, where the expression, okay, kates, again, the arrow that flies, kates Ya'uf, could be an allusion to Reshef. Again, that's just a smattering of material from DDD about Reshef. So again, what we've got going on here, is this, the Bible's dipping into and using, again, a matrix of ideas here about natural forces and natural disasters and weather and so on and so forth. And again, instead of affirming that, they're like specific dudes, in the spiritual world that are in charge of that, basically it says, no, all of these forces in nature are at the command of the God of Israel. And it uses military language. It uses, the visualization of a retinue and all these things. The biblical writers do these things, but their point is that, the way that the Canaanites really think about this is not the case, because, the Canaanite deities that you think are in charge of this really aren't. They really aren't in charge of anything like this. God doesn't have to sort of fight them to get them to not do these things or to do these things. They don't actually have any control over this. Again, that's the theological point that the biblical writers in these smattering of verses are trying to make. Verses 11 through 13 read this again. For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. And that should be very familiar from the temptation of Jesus by Satan. You will tread, again, here's the part that isn't quoted, you will tread on the lion and the adder, the young lion and the serpent you will trample underfoot. Now there's a number of kind of interesting things going on here. Obviously the serpent imagery is what grabs you right away. We have these same terms, again, these serpentine terms mentioned in Deuteronomy 32, again, about the enemies of Israel, both in terms of human enemies and, supernatural enemies. Their wine is the poison of serpents, the cruel venom of asps. So there's a generic reference in Deuteronomy 32. The more interesting one to me is Psalm 58. And I'll tell you why it's interesting. Psalm 58 is considered by many scholars. We actually ought to do an episode on Psalm 58 and Psalm 82, because Psalm 58 is sort of it's viewed as a psalm that picks up themes from Psalm 82. And I'll just read you the first verse. This is ESV. Do you indeed decree what is right, you gods? Okay, the Hebrew is elem. And basically, I don't want to say every, because there's always an exception, but I'm, pretty much every scholar, every Hebrew scholar, Old Testament scholar, believes that LM here is actually an old form of the plural of El. In other words, gods, like Elim, even though it's not spelled that way. Because we have in Psalm 89 the B'nai Elam or B'nai Elim, it just depends on, the manuscript tradition and so on and so forth. And I tend to agree with that, because you just listen to parts of the psalm. Do you indeed decree what is right, O you gods? Do you judge the children of men uprightly? No. In your hearts you devise wrongs. Your hands deal out violence on the earth. Does this sound like Psalm 82 verses 2 through 5? Yeah, it does. Because this is what they get accused of. And then it goes on and it says in verse 4, I'll just read, the wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray from birth, speaking lies. They have venom like the venom of a serpent, like the deaf adder that stops its ear, so that it does not hear the voice of charmers or the cunning enchanter. O God, break the teeth in their mouths, tear out the fangs of the young lions. And you can see the serpent and the lion imagery here that is operative in Psalm 91. But you can also, if you're thinking Psalm 82, the scripture has this notion that extends from Deuteronomy 32 and Daniel 10, that the things that go on with wicked people, wicked rulers, behind that is actually, wicked supernatural beings that influence that chaos that goes on earth. They don't do anything about it to correct it. And, they either permissively let it go, or if we take the wording of this psalm, it seems a little more intentional. No, in your hearts you devise wrongs. Your hands deal out violence on the earth. If you go to the end of the psalm, this is another reason why people look at this as sort of a maybe a dim mirror of Psalm 82. The way it ends, mankind will surely say, or will say, surely there is a reward for the righteous. Surely there is a God, like a real God, who judges on earth. And if you actually look in the Hebrew text, we have, surely there is Elohim, who judges on the earth. And interestingly enough, the verbal there, it's not actually a finite verb. Again, I'm sorry for the grammar lapse here, but I just have to get into this because somebody's going to look at this and say, oh, Mike, it should be gods, in verse 11. Surely there are gods who judge on earth. Well, that's what he's saying isn't happening in verse 1. So there's a problem right there. He said, well, it has to be plural because the verbal here is the plural participle, shophatim. Well, that's true. That's true. It's not a finite verb, for one thing, and therefore a participle, which is classified as a verbal adjective, which can be used substantively, in other words, functioning as a noun, can be used as a plural of majesty. And that's what you have here. There are a few of these in the Hebrew Bible where a participle functions as a plural of majesty precisely because it's doing service as a noun. Okay, in what would be called a verbless clause. Okay. So, again, just to lapse into that a little bit, just so that the listeners out there know that, yes, we can cover these bases. What you have here is a very similar call to the way Psalm 82 ends. Arise, O God, and, judge the earth, take the nations, that kind of wording, again, however we want to translate that. So there's a similarity there. And again, my point is that here you've got a psalm that has stuff in it that sounds like Psalm 82 and yet also has this serpent language, this adder language, and this lion language but that we also encounter in Psalm 91. And elsewhere, the chaos enemies of earth, okay, are cast this way as tanin, sea monsters or serpents. You've got Pharaoh, okay, you got Pharaoh in Exodus 29 and Exodus 32. You've got the whole incident with Moses and Aaron in front of Pharaoh with the serpents. The staff becomes a serpent, devours the other two. You got some of these words in there. You got Psalm 74 that uses the language, of the sea monsters. God slays the sea beasts. And Isaiah 51:9 is another one. Isaiah 27:1 is probably, the most famous eschatological one. I'll just read it again, just to give you a flavor for the kind of language that's here. In that day, the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent. Leviathan, the twisting serpent. I mean, there you get the serpent language. You've got Nakash there a couple of times. He will slay the dragon that is in the sea. That's Tanin, and that's the word that occurs in Psalm 91. So this terminology is used again for chaos agents, either supernatural, emblematic, or human. I mean, again, it's a matrix of ideas, as I often say. So what you have in Psalm 91, again, focusing on verses 5 and 6 and 11 to 13, is a lot of powers of darkness language. You've got a lot of supernatural chaos language. You've got connections to Deuteronomy 32. You've got a peripheral connection to Psalm 82 going on here. Basically, supernatural bad guys are littered in among the verbiage of Psalm 91. And that's going to matter when we get to the Second Temple period, and that's where we're going right now. Now, I came across a couple of articles here, and the links to these articles are going to be on the episode webpage. You probably already know that if you use the website, to get your podcast. But if you don't, go up to the episode webpage and you'll get links to these articles. These are available online, so I'm giving you the links. One of them is by Craig Evans. Again, Evans is a very well-known New Testament scholar, and he had an article back in 2009 on Psalm 91. And it's called Jesus and Evil Spirits, plural, in the Light of Psalm 91. Now, the initial source for that was Baptistic Theologies, Volume 1, 2009, pages 43 through 58. It's also published in a book called Celebrating the Dead Sea Scrolls, a Canadian contribution. It's edited by Peter Flint, the late Peter Flint, and a few other people, which you could, get that book in book form and you'd have the chapter. But anyway, you can get the essay on a link on the episode web page. Craig Evans himself was nice enough to post this. I don't know when he did it, but he did it, so it's up there. Now, in this article, Evans starts on, very early with this comment. He says, commentators have long suspected that this psalm was understood as offering assurance against demonic affliction. Chances are very high that when you read Psalm 91, just, in your Bible reading at some point in life, like me, I wasn't thinking about demonic affliction at all. After listening to the first half of this podcast, you could see why they would think that way. Because it is. Okay, this is how they look. This is the worldview, all right? So again, Evans says, commentators have long suspected that this psalm was understood as offering assurance against demonic affliction. He says, however, the discovery at Qumran, this is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, of Psalm 91, and here's the key, in combination with exorcism psalms, has pretty well settled the matter once and for all. Psalm 91 apparently was understood in the time of Jesus as offering divine assurances of protection against demonic powers. So the point even then really wasn't specifically, some of the natural things that we would associate. There were people who read them, quite transparently as demonic, attacks from demons. And so this psalm at Qumran was actually grouped in among other exorcistic psalms that are not in the Hebrew Bible, but they're nevertheless, it was part of this group. So again, that's interesting, especially because Satan is going to try to use this. But I should also add that it was also understood as a Psalm of David. Now, if you go in your English Bible and you go to Psalm 91, this one doesn't have a superscription. It doesn't say Psalm of David, Psalm of Asaph, or anybody else. Okay. Well, at Qumran, in the Dead Sea Scroll version of the Psalm, and it's the Psalm. It has a superscription, and it's a Psalm of David, which gives it the Messianic flavor, does it not? Okay. So again, there's another little thing running under the surface that's kind of interesting. Now, I'm gonna link out. In fact, I'm gonna go to just open up with my software here. I'm gonna go to the Dead Sea Scrolls Study Edition, and Evans is gonna back it up here. Okay, I found it. Evans is going to reference 11Q. Let's see, 11Q. 5 first, and then he's going to go into 11Q11, which is this collection of exorcistic psalms. I'll read here 11Q5. When I say the word blank, it just means that there's a gap in the text. All right. So blank, initially, and then the editor presumes that there's some note about these are the compositions of David, because the first line that actually shows up is, and David, son of Jesse, was wise, and a light like the light of the sun, and learned, blank, and discerning and perfect in all his paths before God and men, and blank, line 4, Yahweh gave him a discerning and enlightened spirit, and he wrote psalms, 3,600. That's a lot more than we get in the book of Psalms, by the way. So David writes 3,600, and he wrote songs to be sung before the altar over the perpetual offering of every day, for all the days of the year, 364. And for the Sabbath offerings, 52 songs. And for the offerings of the first days of the months. And for all the days of the festivals. And for the Day of Atonement, 30 songs. And all the songs which he spoke were 446. Okay? So we got a 3,600 number. We've got 446. And this is the end of line 9. And songs, going into line 10, he also wrote songs to perform over the possessed, 4. The total was 4,050. All that stuff all together. 4,050 items that David wrote. Verse 11, all these he spoke through the spirit of prophecy, which had been given to him from before the Most High. Okay, that's 11Q5. So we learned David was quite prolific. And among the stuff that he produced were 4 songs to perform over the possessed. It seems these 4 psalms were discovered providentially, coincidentally, however you want to look at that. These 4 psalms were discovered in the same cave. They were labeled 11Q11. There were 3 new psalms in this group and Psalm 91. Now, the ones that are not in the Hebrew Bible are very clearly exorcistic psalms. They're all fragmentary, but all of them mention demons with confrontational language. And then you get Psalm 91 in among them. And I'm going to read you, again, a lot of this is fragmentary. This is 11Q11, first column. We get a reference in line 4 to Yahweh. Line 5 contains the word dragon. Then you have the earth. We get the word exorcising as in exorcising demons in line 7. Line 10 is the word demon. I mean, these are just a few words. Column 2 is a little bit more, and interestingly enough, it mentions Solomon. Line 2 says there's a blank, and then Solomon, he will invoke, and then a blank. And then the next line is the spirits and the demons, blank on either side. So again, you get this, okay, we got Solomon looped in here. Well, it's the Psalm of David, and okay, it's Davidic, and the line of kingship and demons. All right, so you get a little feel for that. Column 3, again, is kind of more of the same thing. I want to get to the 5th column here, column 5. It has, it's got a good amount preserved, but it's really interesting. Line 3, it says the volunteers of blank, and then it actually names Raphael. Okay, the archangel. Raphael has healed them. Line 4, of David, against, and then a long blank, and it ends with Yahweh. Line 5, the heavens, when he comes upon you in the night, you shall say to him, who are you? And you're going to love this. Line 6, who are you, O offspring of man and the seed of the holy ones? Does that sound familiar? Can you say with me, probably if there's children there, we probably want to say this, but bastard spirits, demons. Okay, this is a Genesis 6 language, connection. Who are you, O offspring of man and of the seed of the holy ones? Your face is a face of delusion, and your horns, your horns are horns of illusion. You are darkness and not light. Line 8, injustice and not justice. The chief of the army, Yahweh, will bring you down. And then verse 9, to the deepest Sheol, he will shut the bronze gates. I mean, again, does this sound familiar? This is, again, part of this material in 11Q11, in which, right after this, in the next column, we get Psalm 91. In its entirety. It's not completely identical because Solomon, well, that's a Targum. I don't want to say that, but there are Aramaic translators that read into a little part of this, but it's very, very, very close, to the Psalm 91 that we have. It's basically identical, but not completely. But it begins this way: of David. Okay, and we get this of David. Again, they have it. It is bracketed here, but the Septuagint of this psalm, has the superscription, so that. And the Septuagint is going to align well with this, and so they're figuring this is sort of the Hebrew original here. In the shelter of the Most High, shadow of the Almighty, so on and so forth. So you get Psalm 91 there, and it goes down through about verse 14, parts of verse 14. So Psalm 91, again, this is why scholars look at this and they go, sure looks like, in the words of Evans, the appearance of Psalm 91 in 11Q11 strongly suggests that this psalm was understood not only at Qumran as an exorcism psalm, but was understood this way among the Jews in the time of Jesus. And I agree. I think Evans is tracking, well on that. So a couple of specific items. Again, I looped in the Septuagint. So the Septuagint attributes the psalm to David. Again, through the fancy and wonderful world of textual criticism, the material at Qumran here in Psalm 91 aligns very closely, with little idiosyncrasies we'd get in the Septuagint, as opposed to the MT. And so odds are very high that this would have been the Hebrew underlying Septuagint. And so the scholars feel quite confident in saying, this one had a superscription as well, because the Septuagint one surely does. Again, maybe it didn't, but it's a good argument. It's sound in its reasoning. Another thought is, again, one of these exorcistic psalms. Okay, one of these exorcistic psalms. I didn't read all of them, the whole lot of them. One of them mentions Resheph by name. Again, and we have again the reference in Psalm 91 to the arrows, which we talked about earlier. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to create sort of a a picture, a context, a framework for how people in the first century, when you if you were doing the sword drill, Psalm 91, what's that about? Chances are there's going to be somebody in the crowd, probably more than one, that would say demons, exorcism, because this content is in there. Again, it shouldn't be, it wouldn't have been a foreign thought again to somebody in Jesus' day, but to us, we're not, we're reading this filtered through an English translation, so it's really hard to pick this up. And plus, we wouldn't have the context of Qumran and all this other stuff, and the Septuagint. We need to give the Septuagint some due here. So Evans also writes, the content of Psalm 91 readily lends itself to an exorcistic function. Verse 3 promises deliverance from the deadly pestilence, while verse 5 promises the faithful person that he will not be afraid of the terror of the night or the plague that rages at noon. By the way, that is not the way plagues actually work. Natural forces, they don't time themselves. The creatures mentioned in verse 13, serpent, sea monster, and the like, were sometimes understood as demonic beings. As already mentioned, the sea monster, and Tanin in verse 13, also appears in line 5 of, again, one of these exorcistic psalms. So these exorcistic psalms have the same vocabulary as Psalm 91, and Psalm 91 is lumped in there, including, among them. Evans also throws in a note here that I think is worth mentioning, that the Aramaic translator, the Targum translator of verses 5 to 10, it's very clear that he took it as an exorcistic psalm, and he loops Solomon into this. I'm going to read you the Targum translation that Evans has referenced in his article. You will not be afraid of the terror of the demons. It actually puts the word in there. You will not be afraid of the terror of the demons that go about in the night, nor of the arrow of the angel of death that he shoots in the daytime. You can see how the Targum is expansive here. Nor of the death that goes about in the darkness, nor of the company of demons that destroy at noon. You will call to remembrance the holy name, and 1,000 will fall at your left side and 10,000 at your right hand. But they will not come near to you to do harm. You will only look with your eyes, and you will see how the wicked are being destroyed. Solomon answered, and this is what he said, because you, the Lord, are my refuge. In the most high dwelling place you have set the house of your Shekinah, the Shekinah, but Shekinah. The Lord of the world responded, and this is what he said, no evil shall befall you, and no plague or demons shall come near your tent. If you compare, what's going on in the Hebrew and the Aramaic, it's first couple of verses sort of already set the stage for this Solomonic language. Here's the first couple, verses 2 and 3. Hebrew has, he will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust, for he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the deadly pestilence. The Targum says, David said, I will say to the Lord, and then there's a gap, an ellipsis, verse 3, for he will deliver you, Solomon, my son, puts Solomon right in there, from the snare and the obstacle, from death and confusion. So that it takes the line from verse 3, for he will deliver you, this generic you, and the Targum translator interpreted that as David speaking to Solomon, his son. That's how Solomon gets looped in there, and he gets looped back, later on as we read. Now, again, let's sort of pool all this data and think about Psalm 91 and how to read it, and then we'll get into what happens with Jesus real briefly. To me, it is important that we have a tradition that there's a superscription here in the Septuagint, and again, very, very, very likely at Qumran for this being a Psalm of David, again, which certainly gives it a Messianic feel. It's also really important that Psalm 91 is lumped in with exorcistic psalms at Qumran, and those other exorcistic psalms in which it is bundled have, again, very clear, demonic, sinister, powers of darkness language in them, some of which is also in Psalm 91. Again, I think that's important. The name, the inclusion of Resheph and that other stuff, I think is important. Again, just the ancient Near Eastern, the Canaanite backdrop that we talked about earlier is important. I mean, to me, these things need to inform how we read Psalm 91 and then how we understand its use and Jesus' rebuttal in Matthew 4, and it just accounts of the temptation there. So in biblical days, in the wider ancient Near East, I think we could say this: natural disasters and disease, were linked to demons because they were a threat to human life. They are chaos forces that just happen to people, and again, that's going to get linked to the notion of supernatural chaos forces. There's an Old Testament scholar from the Netherlands, Dr. Garrett, and I'm hoping I get this name right, Vreugdenhil. I'm not sure that's correct, but you can also find a short paper that he wrote online. We'll have this link on our website as well. Demonic Doom, Psalm 91, and the Threat of Evil Spirits and Demons. It's also very good, very interesting. His short article actually sort of sketches out his own research. He has a book coming out on Psalm 91. It's not shipping yet. I actually looked it up because we have corresponded briefly. It's published by Brill, so it's really expensive, but hopefully it'll come back in paperback, or if you're at SBL this year, you can get it at a discount. But it's a book specifically on Psalm 91 and this demonic aspect, demonic orientation of the psalm. In his short paper, when he's talking about his research, he describes some of the things that he investigated, and he writes this. He says, in chapter 3, he's using the editorial we. In chapter 3, we asked, which place do demons have in the worldview of ancient Israel? What did the Israelite men and women think of demons? Did they play a part in everyday life? On which fields of life do they experience the activities of demons? So he's asking these worldview questions. Then he goes through, at one point in the article, and of course the book, he goes through Jewish incantation texts, or Jewish magical texts, as scholars like to refer to them. These are, they would write these in bowls and cups. We have pieces of pottery, or sometimes the whole thing, or pieces of jewelry, things that you would wear on your person, on your body. They're, I hate to use the word spell, but I guess that's fair. Incantation sounds a little more neutral, but they're short written prayers, and I guess you could call some of them spells. That's probably fair, to ward off demons. And he actually gives an example of one. Again, this is Jewish material, of one that comes from the Ageniza at Cairo in this short article. And he writes this: the amulet mentions the name of the woman who was wearing this thing, Habiba bint Zorah. It is possible that amulet was worn as a kind of necklace, or that the amulet was located near the place where she would give birth to her child. On the first column, the purpose of the amulet is stated, namely, quote, to drive away all kinds of demons and demonesses, lilies and liliths, evil diseases, harmful male spirits, and harmful female spirits, and evil spirits, male and female. I mean, just running the gamut here, so that she, the baby, be healthy and protected. Well, it could be the baby or the mother. I mean, we'd have to read the full book, I guess, to determine how that determination is made. So that she be healthy and protected from any harm for all time. Between the lines of the incantation, we find on the first column a reference to Psalm 91. The psalm is cited according to the principles of notarikon, and Dr. Vreugdenhil defines that for us in a footnote. I'll read the footnote. Vreugdenhil writes, the word notarikon is borrowed from the Greek language and was derived from the Latin word notarius, which means shorthand writer. It is a method of deriving a word by using each of its initial or final letters to stand for another word, to form a sentence or an idea out of the words. So, I mean, this was just sort of it's probably not a memory technique. Maybe it would become that if, you made one of these and then you just, you prayed through the psalm, or you recited part of the psalm, and this would help you to do that. Or it could be supplemental. You could be kind of, orienting a prayer around, in this case, Psalm 91, and adding these other details, based on, your memory cue would be the first or last letter of a line or a word in the Psalm. So these are the kind of texts that he deals with in this book. But what it shows is, again, that there were people who quite obviously, again, considered Psalm 91 to have something to do with protection from demons. okay, as opposed to protection from a cold, or something like that. I mean, it was more supernatural to them. Now, from my own take, as with other matters of biology and understanding of nature and whatnot, it's easy for us to look and say, well, they didn't have tools of science. We know how weather works, we know how disease works, we know how contagions work, all that sort of stuff, and we do. So I think it's obvious that science has informed us how diseases and weather works. Again, I talk about this kind of thing on my FAQ. When we get comments like this, from people living in the second or the first millennium BC or the first century, again, and we do have tools of science that we can evaluate what they're saying about the natural world. That's the key thought. We can evaluate what they're saying about the natural world. That doesn't give us permission to evaluate what they say about the supernatural world, which doesn't conform to the tools and methods of scientific inquiry. Those are two different things. Even though the ancient person married the two, those are two different things. So we could say, well, hey, we know how the weather works, and it's not empowered by a demon. We get that, but that doesn't mean that the demons or the gods or, again, these supernatural entities, it doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means that certain people misappropriated an ability to them. Okay, that's what it means. So, a lot of people want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Again, me, this podcast, we don't do that here. We try to be fair with the worldview and with the data. And in this case, these passages weren't designed to tell us how the natural world works. They just weren't. God chose writers who didn't know these things, and he knew that. So they're not doing science, they're doing theology. And so we don't have the authority to use science, a thing they're not writing about, to dismiss a thing they are writing about. And that Scripture affirms, again, a supernaturalistic worldview. So I think Habakkuk 3:5 actually helps here. It doesn't sever a link between what's going on in the spiritual world and the human world. It doesn't do that. God can do something to influence the weather as a judgment or as a blessing. I mean, God can do these things. They're not out of the purview of divine activity. But the point is that it's God. It's not lesser, inferior beings who are doing this. And again, I think Habakkuk 3:5 helps there. Such things, Scripture affirms, operate under the sovereignty of God. And to get the message across, get that message across, Habakkuk 3:5 has the Canaanite deities, or the demons, again, in Second Temple thinking. Recall that daimonion, has sort of a generic term for a lot of these entities. It has the Canaanite deities that were thought responsible for such things held in check by Yahweh, or in some sense displaced by Yahweh as to their presumed abilities. Now, from my demons book, I'm going to read a little paragraph here. I write, in addition to symbols representing the encompassing reach of chaos, biblical writers use the names of deities from Canaanite religion attached to specific natural phenomena and illnesses. Unlike their polytheistic counterparts, they did not have distinct deities acting independently of the true God in charge of those forces. Just as death itself was under the authority of Yahweh, so were disease and natural disaster. Yahweh was the lone sovereign. For example, when Egypt was punished with plagues, it wasn't because Yahweh had to request the services of a deity or a demon. The Most High either acts unilaterally or dispatches a supernatural underling to dispense judgment through such disasters. In other words, he's the one in charge. So, again, that's from the New Demons book. The end result is that it shouldn't surprise us that ancient people presumed the gods or demons were behind natural forces. That shouldn't surprise us. As Christians, we can affirm the general idea, God is in control, but deny that demonic entities are the ones pulling the levers here. Biblical theology has God in control of such things, but as Jesus himself points out in Luke 13, and we need to loop Luke 13 in, this is not the temptation, this is something I blogged about on my website. As Jesus himself points out in Luke 13, it's not like we should think God is pushing buttons on every event in the natural world or aiming at wicked people when things happen. Some things just happen. That is the way the world works. Imperfection is part of the created world at the beginning, and its imperfection is made worse by the fall and its curses. The fall didn't result in demons being assigned to diseases and disasters, nor is there any biblical indication the world was created that way. And Habakkuk 3:5 is an example where the biblical writers try to push back on the common thinking, and I think correctly frame these things. But again, I will link to my thing on Luke 13 as well that I wrote recently on the episode webpage. So let's get to Jesus and ask ourselves the obvious question. We'll go to Matthew 4 here, just so that we get the flavor. But this is a really common passage. I think all of you are going to be familiar with it. Let's just read this. So Matthew 4:1, that Jesus was led by the Spirit in the wilderness. Other gospels say he was compelled by the Spirit to go out into the wilderness. Of course, that's where you would find the devil, the domain of death and chaos, that which is anti-Eden. All right. He goes out there, he fasts 40 days, 40 nights, and he's hungry, and the tempter shows up. Satan shows up, and then he starts, talking to him. We get this conversation. And in verse 3, the tempter, Satan, says to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But he, Jesus, answered, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Verse 5, then the devil took him to the holy city and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, this is verse 6, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone." So that's where he quotes Psalm 91. Now, again, the obvious question is, why would he pick that psalm? Why would he do this? Again, my take is that Satan knows the content of the psalm. He knows how people think about the psalm. People think about Psalm 91 as an exorcistic document that Yahweh and David and the Son of David, the Messiah, has command over demons. And surely, if this is the case, I could ask you to throw yourself off the temple, off the pinnacle of the temple, and his angels will keep you from harm. So let's see. If you're really the Messiah, you should be able to jump right off here and get rescued by angels, and then we'll know that you, in fact, are superior to demons, to the guys who work for me, and even me myself. So let's see that. Now, there are a couple of ways you could look at this. One is he's using the psalm to have Jesus prove the point and quote unquote win the confrontation. Show your mastery over the powers of darkness. Show your status as the Son of God. Show your status as being, really equal to Yahweh. Again, when we get right down to the rest of the Old Testament theology about the Son of David, the Messiah is God. Let's see that. Show us that you're superior to Deor and Ketev and Resheph. We want to see that. Prove it. Now, what does Satan have to gain? I look at this and think it's a fishing expedition. Let's say that Jesus says, "Okay, here we go. Geronimo," and he takes off, over the pinnacle of the temple. Now, think about it. You got two outcomes. One is that angels show up, catch him, and okay, point proven. Like what does that do? The other one is Jesus hits the bottom and dies. Okay. And God has to raise him up to make the plan work. Oh, and wouldn't that be interesting? Because if that happened, Satan would know that if this guy dies, God's going to bring him back to life. And I would assert that God and Jesus don't want Satan to know that. All right? And the first option, that Jesus jumps and is caught by angels, that isn't the plan. And not only isn't that the plan, but Jesus is not the monkey to Satan's organ grinder. Okay? He is not here to perform for Satan or anyone else. He's on a mission. He knows what the mission is. Frankly, your request, Satan, your challenge, can be safely ignored. Okay? It can be safely ignored. It serves us, me and my Father, no purpose to entertain you or inform you in any way. So what does Jesus do? He responds with Scripture and says, again, it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test, which to me, I read that as a double entendre. He's saying, look, I'm not going to put God to the test. And it's also it can also be read like, you shouldn't put God to the test, and you're putting me to the test. Do the math, dude. Do the math. But he's not going to perform. He's not a performer. He owes him no information and no entertainment. And I think, for our application, why even mention this? I mean, I think in our day and age, and we're going to end with this, the point is not, again, just arcane knowledge about Psalm 91. I wanted to do all that to make the point that, Jesus is, in theory, Jesus could have jumped off, been rescued, and prove the point. I am superior to all these things. I'm superior to every knucklehead, every supernatural knucklehead named in Psalm 91. There you go. But Jesus doesn't do that. He does not presume to act in a way that is contrary to what God wants him to do, and that ultimately is contrary to the point of the psalm. And I would just suggest, to us that it might be a good idea to think of Psalm 91 the way it's supposed to be thought of. I mean, this is a protection from supernatural darkness. So, what we've said today about Psalm 91 and Psalm 91 itself, the general teaching point here is not that this material is supposed to give us a video game or a professional wrestling analogy for the pecking order of the supernatural world. That's just not what it's supposed to be, and it's not what we're trying to do here. We shouldn't over-literalize the material for the purpose of analyzing, which disaster did I hear about on TV? Was demon caused or not? Is the virus, the work of Satan or demons or, okay, if you're using Psalm 91 to do that, that is as much a misuse of the Psalm, as a misuse of any other passage. I mean, it's just not what it's there for. Rather, the Psalm is a Messianic Psalm about David's agent, his ultimate son, okay, the Davidic Messiah's power over forces of darkness. Okay, that is what the psalm is about. It's also not a psalm that teaches us we won't get sick. The psalm is about the victory, again, over supernatural darkness. God is in control of the forces of nature. He is not powerless to protect us as though he isn't in control of nature. But Psalm 91 is ultimately not about, specific calamities and forces of nature. It doesn't guarantee you won't get sick or won't get hit by a hurricane or will never live in a place that gets an earthquake or, fill in the blank. It doesn't guarantee those things. Ultimately, it's about the Messiah's victory over the powers of darkness, and all who are in the shelter of the Most High, all who are in Christ, in New Testament parlance, will overcome the evil one and the evil ones through Christ. It's his faithfulness at the temptation in this regard that is, it's crucial. It's crucial to what later happens. Had he tipped off, had he tipped the hand, okay, in the temptation account here, and had Satan learned that, if you kill him, God's just going to bring him back from the dead, or God won't let him be killed. See, that changes tactically what the powers of darkness will do about the Messiah. See, what God needs to happen, what the end game is that Jesus does die. So we're not taking that, we're not putting that card on the table for Satan to learn anything. So ultimately, Jesus' faithfulness here in Matthew 4, which involves this challenge drawn from Psalm 91, is crucial to Jesus' later faithfulness in going to the cross, where he does get raised from the dead and ascends to the seat of power once more, so that we reap those benefits, and so that we, again, are in the shelter of the Most High. We are in Christ, and we have victory over all of these evil ones. I mean, it's a coherent, sensible portrayal, not only in terms of the Old Testament, but also just kind of what the terms become in Matthew 4, in the temptation scene. God either won't let him die, or if he does, he'll raise him from the dead. Again, if I'm the cosmic genius of the supernatural evil world, therefore killing the guy isn't a solution. But that's exactly what needs to happen. And so Jesus is not putting the card on the table. So it's actually really interesting. I mean, Satan kind of knows where to hit him, but at the end of the day, Jesus is, we don't owe you anything. We're not going to presume. Okay, you should not put the Lord your God to the test. We owe you nothing, no entertainment, no information. So it's really a good chess match when you really think about it. And again, the context of Psalm 91, I think, colors it in the right way.
Mike, can you speak about Solomon? In the Second Temple period, their literature, I guess the Second Temple Jews didn't freak out when they saw Jesus casting out the demons because they've been reading about Solomon as an exorcist. Is that right?
Yeah. If you recall, we did an old episode on this. It's number 87. Man, that seems like a long time ago. Google has episode 87, Exorcism of Demons, as part of the Messianic profile.
There you go.
Because in that episode, if you recall, we asked the question just exactly like you put it. Like, why, when Jesus runs around, casting out demons, and that gets used to reinforce the idea, his identity as the Messiah, like this has to be the Messiah. Look at that. Okay. Since there's no really, to our reading, there's no really clear element like that in the Old Testament. You never read about, like, there's no episode in the Old Testament where a demon gets cast out of anybody. I mean, nobody, like, much less, David or the son of David. And so it creates this sort of disconnect, like, that detail doesn't make any sense. It must be something new that the New Testament writers made up, but it's not. And just like you said, they're talking about this way about Solomon. They have this tradition about David. And so when Jesus starts doing this, it's like, okay, he has just become part of the discussion, about is he the Messiah? So it's actually a big deal.
All right, Mike. Well, that was a good one. That's basically probably a chapter out of your demons book. I would imagine this.
It actually isn't.
It is.
It actually isn't. I do. No, it's not. I do demon stuff and the natural world, a little bit, but I don't have like a chapter on Psalm 91. I reference it, but this is new content. So now I've spilled Unseen Realm 2 content here onto the podcast. That's all right.
I'd say, love it. Anytime we can get that to happen, I'll take it. All right, Mike.
Squeeze that out of me, right?
Absolutely. All right, Mike. Well, that was a good one. We appreciate it. All right, guys. Well, with that, I want to thank everybody for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.